This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for July 31st, 2019, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Cristina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hey, checkers.
We have a great show for you today. Adam is going to explore whether all table salt is sea salt.
That's right.
And I'm going to do a little review of the book Why We Sleep. But first, what's the deal with Mercury in retrograde?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I can't believe we've never covered this on the show, guys. But it's that time of year again. Mercury's in retrograde. Or is it?
I'm not sure what that means.
Okay, so Mercury is said to be in retrograde. But it's remarkable how many people don't truly understand what that means. And I linked to several articles. But Mother Nature Network and Live Science each had a great, simple explanation. So let's start there and work back. Now, all planets in our solar system rotate around the sun in the same direction, east to west. 3 or 4 times a year, Mercury is said to go retrograde, or in other words, it's moving in an opposite direction to planet Earth from west to east. Now, if you look up the dictionary definition of the word retrograde, it really does mean moving backwards. However, here is the catch. This is an optical illusion. Now, the example MNN gives is like the experience you may have when you're in a car driving on a highway and you're moving faster than a train that's riding alongside of you. So the train looks like it's moving backwards, but it's just moving slower than you. So I had this similar experience when we took a train to Ottawa recently. The train beside us started moving forward. We were still, and it felt like we were moving backwards. It is a really strange sensation.
Yeah, I've seen that when you have like maybe a large truck next to you, and it starts to move.
And you're like, oh, crap.
And you're like, what's going on? You know, you kind of pound the brake, and people can get in accidents if those situations occur in a certain way, right?
So you're saying the train was in retrograde?
Yes.
I mean, that's how I always describe it, so that's interesting that it aligns with this other Mercury thing.
Now, Mercury's orbit is smaller and faster than our planet. So when the Earth passes Mercury in orbit around the sun, it creates the illusion that it's moving in retrograde. But it's simply moving slower than the Earth. So as Life Science says, this is a good quote, all of the planets exhibit apparent retrograde motion, although it plays out slightly differently for planets farther from the sun than Earth versus those like Mercury that are closer to the sun than the Earth. So NASA also has an article that talks about it, and they say retrograde motion is not real, in that the planet does not physically start moving backwards in its orbit. It just appears to do so because of the relative positions of the planet and Earth and how they are moving around the sun. I'm now hearing Darren in my head going, I get it.
But from an astrology point of view, isn't it sort of Earth-centric? It's all about how it is relative to the Earth. I mean, it's all nonsense, but...
And that's the point.
Kind of answered your own question there.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert for the rest of the segment, Adam.
Yeah.
Now, a little bit of history. Mercury retrograde actually dates back to the mid-18th century. Mental Floss notes that British agricultural almanacs highlighted it so farmers could sync planting schedules to the stars. Then in the late 19th century, publications like The Astrologer's magazine perpetuated the association between Mercury retrograde and bad weather or bad luck. And that's why you may keep hearing people lately blame their misfortunes on the fact that Mercury is in retrograde this month. Now, honestly, it's easy to see why there's so much misinformation still floating around in the 21st century. Modern astrologers to this day warn people to watch their backs this time of year or don't make any critical decisions about your life. When I started Googling this, the first page of hits had articles like this. astrologyzone.com. Keeping track of Mercury retrograde periods can allow you to increase your productivity and avoid at least some of the frustration they can bring about. astrostyle.com. Brace yourself for breakdowns. Communication planet Mercury turns retrograde from July 7th to 31st, 2019. Truth bombs, travel snags, and technology hiccups are on the horizon. I really had to dig deep for critical thinking-based articles and switch up search terms like Mercury retrograde science or Mercury retrograde is BS to really get to the good stuff, honestly. Even Life Science says this: finding the facts about Mercury's retrograde motion is complicated because it's both a real and imagined phenomenon. Now, if there's one thing that checkers know listening to this and like-minded shows, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And if I can generalize for a moment, we know there's no evidence supporting the belief that there's some correlation between planets and people's behavior. To Adam's point, it's nonsense. For the record, there's no data to support any correlation between the moon and people's behavior either, which I covered on episode 439 with a segment on the lunar effect. Now, planetary astronomer and UCLA prof Jean-Luc Margot tells Life Science, quote, "The idea that the gravity from these very distant bodies affects our lives in some way just doesn't work in the framework of physics." Now, despite access to facts and people much smarter than me who debunk it time and time again, astrology is as popular as ever. The New York Times cites a 2018 Pew Research Center survey of American adults, which found 37% of women and 20% of men said they believed in astrology. Now, by the way, the highest demo was ages 30 to 49, followed by 18 to 29. Now, that article goes on to say that online searches for the term Mercury retrograde have, quote, risen dramatically over the last 5 years, according to Google data. I don't want to be a total party pooper. I know it's a social icebreaker and it's a fun hobby for some people. And unless someone asks me directly what my sign is or how Mercury retrograde is treating me, I'm not going to impose myself on their conversations. I also know that no amount of reasoning and evidence will change some people's minds.
Is that what their horoscope says?
Yes.
Such a Taurus. Oh my God.
My horoscope says I'm closed-minded and tend to believe in astrology. Oh, that's interesting.
That's so Scorpio of you, Darren. I don't know what your sign is. And again, it's all nonsense.
Part Gemini, part Taurus, because the whole thing has to shift because things have changed in the past 2,600 years.
Yeah.
What a skeptic.
As a card-carrying member of TRC, though, armed with this info, I am willing to try and educate the next person who tells me they are having a crappy day because of Mercury retrograde, and I hope you guys do too.
Well put.
Indeed, it's tempting to be dismissive of such people and wondering if they're having a crappy day because they lack critical thinking skills. But we know almost all of us have critical thinking in many domains. And in some domains, we're very good at critical thinking. In other ones, we just don't do it much at all. So perhaps the astrology is the one that stands out for other people. But we all have our own that other people aren't as much aware of just because we don't talk about it as much.
So interestingly, someone commented on our Facebook page about this. I posted a meme about astrology versus astronomy versus cosmology. And they said, well, maybe it's because Mercury's in retrograde. And I said, I can't actually tell whether or not you're being serious or you're making a joke. And she said, well, I actually read that. And I said, maybe we need to cover this on the show. And she said, it could be baloney. So there are fence sitters on this, and that's why we do this.
Exactly.
Thanks, Cristina. And now to Adam. So I sometimes have some sodium, and I sometimes have some chloride. I sometimes put them together. Is this all from the sea?
Are all table salts created equal? And what does Neil deGrasse Tyson know about any of this?
Who?
Neil deGrasse Tyson. Now, I recently saw what seemed to be an interesting fact about salt. Neil deGrasse Tyson posted the following on Twitter, and I quote, "Not that anybody asked, but all table salt is sea salt. Mined salt just happens to come from long-buried, evaporated prehistoric seas." Hilarious. Amazing. So this fits well with my view that all things people tout as being natural and being somehow superior are better. So I thought, this is funny. This is a great little tidbit that I'll put in my back pocket.
I feel like he starts a lot of tweets with, "Not that anybody asked." And then just drops a bombshell.
Yeah, it's like, Neil, this is Twitter. You don't need to segue into anything. You just write tweet. You only got 200 and whatever characters to do it.
He's like, at Neil. I was thinking to myself today.
Then no one sees it because he didn't do that really great thing where he puts a period before his name.
Oh, snap.
Now, sea salt strikes me as being somewhat akin to something like organic salt, you know? It's just like, here's like the natural version of salt. I'd never really thought about it before, and I'm not sure I ever really appreciated where any salt, sea salt or other kind of salt, really came from. Well, I guess I assumed sea salt came from the sea, but I never really thought about it more than that. But is this the whole story? The first reactions I saw to this message was some friends of mine dunking on him for being a bit of a buzzkill, which reminds me that whenever I come up with some contradictory fact in a social situation, are other people thinking I'm just being that annoying guy, like they were with Neil deGrasse Tyson this time? Maybe. Is it worth it? I don't know. Then I saw a Twitter story. It turns out not all salt comes from the ocean. First, I want to touch on this format a bit. You don't have to say, it turns out X is wrong, when X is a very unintuitive twist on what most people assume. But whatever. It turns out this thing that people only just believed is true is actually not true. It's kind of a weird way of saying something, but whatever. It's a Twitter story. They're terrible. I just see them sometimes when I accidentally click on the little magnifying glass. Now, Micah McKinnon, a geophysicist and science communicator, came in to criticize the statement. And I quote once again, "Well, actually, no. All table salt is rock salt, or in geology talk, halite. All halite is formed, as in evaporite, precipitated out of evaporating saline solution, such as an ocean or a lake. You know, like Utah's Great Salt Lake." She goes on to specify a bit more. Some salty lakes are old oceans, but many are not, such as the Great Salt Lake, which was formed from glacial melt runoff. So glaciers don't come from oceans, they're just usually fresh water, but water that is on land. Now, she does specify that many brine lakes are isolated fragments of ancient oceans. For example, the Dead Sea was originally a bay of the Mediterranean Sea. She also added a bunch of side facts, such as why some edible salts taste different, even though they're all basically sodium chloride, NaCl, the same molecule. And this is because of other trace minerals that are found within the salt. Now, it seemed when I thought of a question that she answered it in one of her questions. She had a lot of kind of like Q&A type of thing. She was doing questions for herself. Likely because others had been asking the same question, and she decided to add them to her same thread. One of those was, what's the difference between a sea and a lake? Now, she says that seas attach to oceans when sea levels are high, but lakes and brine lakes are uplifted above the sea level. So the ocean never really rises enough to spill into them. I thought that was
interesting.
So if an ocean used to be much higher and then lowered, it leaves a salty lake. And then that salt used to be sea salt. So as Neil deGrasse Tyson may have insinuated, this can be where some salts come from that used to be sea salts. And there wasn't a ton of detail in his original tweet. But that's not the full story. To get the full picture, we can ask ourselves where that salt comes from originally. And why are the oceans even salty? So that kind of gives us an idea of where all salts can come from. Now, it comes from land, sort of. So the minerals in rocks that are on land are eroded by slightly acidic rainwater, which breaks down the rock, creating runoffs to streams, rivers, and ultimately this often ends up in the ocean. Chloride and sodium are the more common ions which end up in the ocean, and these are what makes the ocean salty. Salt is literally chloride and a sodium atom. So one chloride, one sodium goes together, NaCl. That's what it is. But most rivers and lakes contain very little salt. Most of what is dissolved from rock is sodium, calcium, magnesium, and potassium. So where is the chloride coming from? Well, volcanic gases contain chlorine and sulfur, and these dissolve in the water in the atmosphere, which forms chloride and sulfate, which rains into the oceans. Now, this can occur outside of oceans as well, such as in Dalal, where there are vast salt lakes, where magma is close to the surface and provides the chloride needed. So it's not that these things can't end up in lakes, but usually not enough of it ends up in there. As for why most fresh water doesn't contain salt, this is simply because they are usually the product of rainwater, or primarily the product of rainwater. So the water in the ocean becomes clouds, gets evaporated by the sun, but the salt stays in the ocean and then it rains down as fresh water, and that's why the water is fresh. So, some side facts about salts. Sea salt is generally obtained by evaporating seawater. This can occur naturally in areas where the sea level is low and the water is completely evaporated in hotter and sunnier times. Now, that said, it is often done using an artificial salt evaporation pond. So basically, seawater from the ocean is fed into large ponds. Then the water is evaporated naturally, leaving only the salt to be harvested. So basically, they cut it off, so no more water's coming in from the ocean or the level lowers, and that's what happens. Mined salt can either be mined directly as a solid or extracted as a solution by pumping water into the deposit, then evaporating the salty water. It's like a weird round way to do it, but it seems to be effective. Now, this can be done using evaporation pans, which are heated, and doing this in a vacuum facilitates evaporation, though obviously back in the day we didn't really have the technology to just create vacuums around them. So semantically, a lot, though not all, table salt was at some point in time sea salt. But are we missing the obvious issue here that most sea salts are at some point put on tables, making them table salts? So this seems like a useless descriptor to me, much like calling a non-Mac computer a personal computer. Are your other computers not personal? Are you using them at the library? So this brings us to the difference between table salt and sea salt. The difference with sea salts are the minerals from the seawater, which can slightly modify the taste if it's sprinkled on food, so if it's just still in its original form. But that taste is usually overpowered if it's used in cooking, so it's dissolved into a dish or into a soup or something like that. All of the other ingredients will make it so that you don't really taste those trace minerals. The so-called table salts do have some additives. Iodine is the main one that they usually put in. An iodine deficiency will cause hypothyroidism, and iodine salt has significantly reduced iodine deficiencies in countries where it is used. Now, there are also anti-caking agents in some salts. Some promoters of sea salt will point to this toxic chemical as being a good reason to use sea salt instead, though it is considered to be safe for consumption by, people in the scientific community, people educated in those ways. Now, double fortified salt contains iron to help avoid iron deficiency anemia. Some salt may also include folic acid, which is important for women who are or who may soon become pregnant. Finally, fluoride salts can be added to some salts. This is more common in European countries where the water is not fluoridated. So to put fluoride in your salt when you have it in the water wouldn't make much sense. So obviously, if you're really into the organic and the natural and all these things, you may think all of these additives are terrible and that you shouldn't have them in your body. But if you follow a sort of scientific worldview, you might think, hey, this is great. This is a nice way to sort of get these things, which may not be in everyone's everyday diet, into your body. Now, before wrapping up, I thought it was interesting to learn that only a very small amount of the salt produced in the world, that being about 6%, is used for food. So I kind of fibbed earlier when I said most sea salt is table salt, but the stuff that ends up on your table is always going to be table in some way. Now, 12% of it is used for water conditioning, 8% for de-icing highways, 6% for agriculture. The other 68%, it's mostly for manufacturing and other industrial processes. So this is used in production of such things as PVC, plastics, and paper pulp. So very little salt ends up in your food, in your plate, in your stomach.
As a proportion, but I'm pretty sure doctors would say too much salt is in our bodies.
6%, if it was 3%, we would solve so many problems. So I don't want to get into the whole health risks versus benefits of salt. Obviously, everything in moderation. If you had zero salt, it might be worse. But yes, there are negative consequences to salts. We can argue that some of those may be overly exaggerated by some people, but I think generally cutting salt is not a bad thing. So it sounds like Neil deGrasse Tyson was somewhat right in that a lot of table salt was at some point in history sea salt, but this is not the full picture. And thanks to science communicators like Micah McKinnon for showing us that not all mined salt needs to have originated in the ocean. You can check out her Twitter thread in the show notes for more salty facts and the descriptions of other non-ocean sourced salt.
Wow, it's really too bad that we didn't have enough time on the show today to squeeze in Neil deGrasse to talk about this.
He would have been a bit salty.
Yes.
Yeah, we wanted to give him some hard-hitting questions, but we just, we ran
Didn't have time. Yeah. Didn't have time. And now we turn to my review of the book Why We Sleep. In short, I recently finished a book about sleep, and today I'm going to give you a review. The book was called Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams by Matthew Walker, PhD. Came out in 2017, and it was great. For those of you who listened to my last segment about quantum uncertainty about 2 episodes ago, you recall one of those books wasn't so great. So the book Why We Sleep was a great palate cleanser. Accessible, informative, and relevant to making one's life better. Walker's a neuroscientist with 20 years of sleep research experience, and I assume a lifetime worth of sleeping experience. All right? Yay. The main thesis is that sleep is good for everything and that people should be getting more of it.
Yeah.
He marshals study after study that indicates sleep helps attention, recall, learning, various health outcomes, and lessens the likelihood of disease. Mark O'Connell, in the Guardian review of the book, linked to in our show notes at trcpodcast.com, describes what he has learned from Walker's book about his lack of sleep a bit more casually. Here's a quote. It has been making me stupider, fatter, unhappier, poorer, sicker, worse at sex, as well as more likely to get cancer, Alzheimer's, and to die in a car crash.
Wow.
So that was the other way of phrasing you should get more sleep. Mm-hmm. Our culture has a problem where people who sleep a lot are seen as lazy instead of adept and intuitive assimilators of scientific research. Go teenagers. Also, for those people who say they only need 5-6 hours a night, they are likely kidding themselves.
Yes.
Walker thinks that very few, as in less than 1% of people, only need several hours of sleep, and the rest of us need 7 to 8 hours. Mm-hmm. He recommends everyone give themselves at least an 8-hour sleep opportunity, basically a time in which you could be sleeping, of which they will probably sleep 90 to 95%.
Meaning when your head hits the pillow, you don't fall asleep right away.
Right. And just you may take a couple moments waking up, but at least give yourself that time to possibly sleep. Mm-hmm. The book is full of interesting tidbits, and here I'll just give you a couple of them. Medical students, some guy in the late 80s who was one of the main creators of the residency program, was a secret cocaine addict.
Oh my gosh.
So he thought
Wow.
med students should live at the hospital, they should give it their all, and they should be able to keep up with him, although he was on cocaine and no one really knew that. So these people are working crazy shifts, 30 hours in a row and all this sorts of thing. And it still persists to this day in a preposterous sense. And for those people who think they don't make more errors, they do make more errors. If you don't have enough sleep, even if you are the privileged few doctors, you are still going to make errors. Now,
Such as not sleeping enough.
Exactly. Now, I do think that certain medical physician residency programs are likely to create a selection bias for those rare people who might only require less sleep. I actually know from the research that people are likely to make more errors if they don't get enough sleep.
Yeah.
There's an interesting little tidbit about birds that many birds can sleep with half their brain at a time. So when you see birds on a wire in a row, the birds in the middle might be sleeping, while the birds on the end are looking with one of their eyes open and the other half of their brain sleeping to sort of take watch. And then what happens is the birds at the end, they won't rotate with the ones in the middle. They'll rotate 180 degrees and then open their other eye to let the other half of their brain sleep.
Wow.
That there are two main reasons why people sleep. One is the circadian rhythm, which is close to a 24-hour day, but not quite. And the other thing is the buildup of something called adenosine, which is kind of like sleep pressure. So the longer you've been awake, the more adenosine in your system, the greater sleep pressure that makes you want to so-called go to sleep. Which is also why if you have a nap later in the day, you've reduced some of the adenosine, reduced some of the sleep pressure, which is why it might be harder to have a deeper sleep at night.
But your circadian rhythm is still there, so there's
Right.
part of the pressure to sleep.
Correct, which is why, I didn't sleep. Why am I more awake now in the morning, even though I didn't sleep all night? Well, that's the circadian rhythm part of it.
Now, you said close to 24 hours. Is it longer or shorter?
That's a good question. I believe it is longer by about 15 minutes.
Okay. So every day you kind of want to go to 15 minutes later.
Every day the societal cues in the sun helps you reorient to a 24-hour time. There was an experiment done. I think 2 guys spent 6 months in total darkness without any time tracking software, and they just try to figure out what their schedule was like after that.
Yeah.
That's where that came from. But it's not like they was able to do a large-scale study with thousands of people to actually get this number.
Sure.
When the rising sun hits the blind, I wake up. It's my natural alarm clock. It's pretty wild. Unless, obviously, I've been up really late at a show or something, but...
I use a sleep mask all the time. So,
Really?
Yeah.
I have babies, so I wake up when someone starts to scream. It's terrible.
You gave me a flashback of some rooster in Hawaii. I'm like, oh, those damn roosters.
Yeah.
In the book, Walker also talks about school start time and how it should be later.
Yes. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that we make teenagers get up at 8 in the morning to go to school.
Right, or worse than that, right? Because if some students are busing in, they might have to get up at 5 or 6. And his thought is that's like you getting up at 3:30, trying to be functional at 5 a.m. day after day. You just can't do it.
So now, I've heard this often, and I've never really, I guess, understood or appreciated it. is the length of their circadian rhythm longer? Because otherwise, getting up early or late should just be a shift, or is it with regards to when the sun is in the sky? Like, what's causing this imbalance?
It seems to be, I assume, like it is the case that the time has just shifted such that they want to go to bed later and wake up later. That's what I understand factually, and I assume it has something to do with puberty and adolescence in that sense.
We have a 13-year-old at home, and he just wants to get up at like noon, and it's
right. Well, that seems perhaps that's the desire. A Walker saying at least start like at 9, 9 or 10.
Yeah.
There's some other interesting aspects where you never quite know, like, oh, right, there's ways to try to explain different phenomena from different angles.
Yeah.
If students are being bussed in, that means they have to get up earlier, which means they're going to do worse.
Yeah.
And it's possibly the case that lower income people have to be bussed in more, which then might affect more minority groups more. So it could be the case that some minority groups are doing worse in school precisely because they're not getting enough sleep compared to other people who get a drive from their parents because their parents are richer.
Yeah.
And it's something I hadn't quite considered as a variable, like, proximity to, location of education and how you get there and your sleep schedule as a teenager.
Sure.
I also found a handy 6-minute video online where Walker busts some sleep myths, most of which are covered in the book, and I'll do a quick rundown of those now, and it's linked to in the show notes. He looks at whether counting sheep helps at all, and his answer is no, it does not. It might actually take longer to fall asleep. It's probably because you're actively engaged in doing something.
Yeah.
I guess if you have a very vivid imagination, make things worse. You're really going to the sheep.
Every time the wolf shows up,
yeah, exactly.
It scares me.
Exactly.
Terminator sheep.
There you go. Listen to me carefully. Bah. Oh, I'll be bah. But he does recommend something very soothing, whatever might work for you. If it's a walk down the beach, you're walking in the woods, some very quiet, restful activity.
To imagine it or to do it?
Oh, no, to imagine it.
Okay.
It's harder to walk down the beach on the regular, depending on where you live.
It seems like brisk walk is not going to put you asleep.
Supposedly, some people think cheese is bad for sleep or gives people nightmares.
Cheese?
Yeah, I hadn't quite heard this, but there's no evidence for it.
Okay.
So get rid of that one. What about white noise? Well, there's no data about white noise, but it does seem to be helpful due to the rhythmic nature, as that is what your brain is engaged in. There were some experiments where they can play tones that match the brain's rhythms.
What?
Right, but it has to be really exact.
Yeah.
So this is not do not try this at home because you're like, oh yeah, I'll do it. I'll get the tone to match my, and if it's off by like a fraction of a second, it screws up your sleep and makes it worse. But your brain, of course, engages in rhythmic waves when it's asleep.
Does it talk about children at all? I get the sense that babies, the white noise may help them a bit more because they fall asleep very easily in the car and things like that.
I don't think there's any reliable data on it.
Okay.
I mean, if you turn it up high enough, it might help the parents sleep. Should we be napping? Well, he says yes and no. So the benefits of learning and memory, because if you go to sleep, you can consolidate what you've learned and it may help learning things as well as calm down your cardiovascular system. But of course, it can prevent you from having a good sleep, as I said. Your adenosine builds up, and if you're tired enough to fall asleep and stay asleep, that can be a good thing, but naps reduce that sleeping pressure. If you can't nap regularly and it seems to hurt your sleep, then don't. Yeah. Some people say, I can't nap. Like, well, okay, that's just who you are. And if you find you can nap, then that's okay. But it's usually imprudent to have a nap later in the day. If anything, it should be midday sort of thing.
So don't have a nap at 6:30.
Should you split your sleep schedule? What about that thing I heard somewhere where in the Middle Ages, or at least in 18th century Britain, they used to sleep 4 hours, take a break, and sleep another 4 hours?
2 sleeps. We talked about those.
Exactly. That is not a thing. Sorry. It was a thing. People supposedly did it, but it was thought to be an artifact of the time.
That sounds terrible.
Is not how
waking yourself up.
So why do you think people do it? I can't remember exactly what I covered, but it sounded like...
Well, now from a different book I'm reading, like who knows about the cultural impact if someone has an idea and everyone thinks they should be doing it.
Yeah.
There are so-called biphasic sleep patterns.
Yeah.
So, okay, let me back up. Most people in the West have one sleep period.
Sure.
But when I say West, there's also like the whole South America West, where a lot of people might take a siesta in the middle of the day.
Yes.
People are getting approximately the same amount of sleep, and if they're having a biphasic sleep, it's usually 6 to 7 hours at night, and then maybe 1 hour in midday.
Sure.
And
so this is people in Europe who eat late and things like that.
Sure, or wherever they are on Earth. And that's because, generally speaking, all humans go through like a post-lunch dip of energy. Yeah. Now, it isn't actually the lunch that does it, although people might think it does because it happens after lunch. Food is sedating in its own way. But generally speaking, even if you didn't have the food, you would then feel lethargic. It's just the way your biological system is organized.
So those Subway commercials are lying.
As such, do not have presentations or meetings between like 1 and 3 if you can avoid it, which of course often you cannot.
No, you can't really. But
Yes.
it's nice to have them in the morning.
But so that don't be surprised if people are nodding off, or you yourself want to as well. So just getting back to whether people slept 4 hours, took a break, and another 4 hours, it seems like they did actually do it, but it was not widespread, and it's not how your so-called natural biological system wants to sleep. And finally, I thought it was very nice in the intro. Matthew Walker said, "If you happen to fall asleep while reading my book, I will take it as a compliment."
That's cute.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Cristina explored whether Mercury was in retrograde, and it is, but it's just an optical illusion. It does not have any mystical experiences that relate to your life. Adam looked into whether all table salt is sea salt, and the answer is no. Shame on you, once again, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And finally, I looked at the book Why We Sleep, and I recommend it because it was great. Until next time, think better, act better.
Sweet James Cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
Once again, thanks for listening, everyone. Cristina explored whether Mercury was in retrograde. Thanks for listening, everyone. Cristina explored whether Mercury... Wow, it's a Vint Cerf situation.